there, drone fans. Rick here again from Drone Valley. In today's clip, I'm going to try and answer an incredibly difficult question. Why won't my phone or tablet run the DJI Go4 application reliably? This is easily the most popular question I get on the channel, and I get tons of email from you guys every week, and I'm happy to get them, asking me, will this particular model of phone or tablet work with this drone running this version of firmware? And it's almost an impossible question for me to answer because there's so many variables in that food chain of connection that I have no control over, not the least of which is the device you pick to load the application on. Then there's the firmware on the quad. Then there's the version of the actual application itself that you're running, and all those things have to line up perfectly for that application to work. Change any one of them and bad things can happen. Now, the problem for me, quite honestly, is that I get frustrated because I feel like the app should just work, right? I run 50 applications on my phone. They all work fine. Why is the DJI Go4 app so difficult to get loaded and working on a variety of devices? So I sat down and I said, I can't just put together a dry list of devices that I've tested with versions of operating system that are on those devices against firmware versions and application versions. It would be a monster list. And honestly, if I put that together, it's going to be stale the day I publish it because new versions of operating systems and firmware are coming out. So instead, what I thought I'd do is sit down and put together a clip that explains the background behind what that application requires of a particular device to run reliably, to help you pick a device that works, or if you've got a device, maybe some tweaks you can make to that device to help it run better. Then I'm going to do a little bit of background on sort of the Apple camp and how they approach running the application, and the Android camp, and why those two are different, and maybe why one of those devices might be a better choice for you. I don't want to get into sort of a big, my dad can beat up your dad over which is better. I'm going to give you sort of a neutral view of both, but there are advantages to one over the other. And then I'll give you at the end of this, maybe 10 or 12 suggestions on little things you can try if you're having trouble with the device that you're actually running the DJI Go4 application on. Changing a few of these things or trying a few of these things might improve the reliability of that application. Doesn't work in all cases, but it might help you if you try some of these things. Now, the hard, cold truth is that not every device is going to support the DJI Go4 application. That's just a fact. Some older devices that are single core, dual core, small amounts of memory, maybe you've got a ton of other applications running on it, probably not a good device to try and run this application on. But if you have a relatively modern device, especially if it's on the list that DJI said's been approved for use of the application, it should run the application. And if it isn't, maybe some of the suggestions at the end of this clip will help you. So I'm going to break this into 4 sections like I'd mentioned. I'm going to do sort of a background of the application itself and what it needs to run. I'll talk about the Apple products, I'll talk about Android, and at the end I'll give you some suggestions and things you can try that may improve that experience for you. So hang on, and we'll get into the background section next. I wanted to start off with a little bit of background on the DJI Go4 application and some of the demands it's going to place on whatever device you decide to load it onto. Now, unlike a lot of the applications you're running today that are fairly simple, that may only touch 1 or 2 subsystems inside the device, the Go4 application is pretty much going to touch everything inside the device at the same time. It's got a voracious appetite for system resources because it's doing so much stuff at the same time. It's doing video streaming, encoding, and buffering. That's a monster task on its own. In addition to that, it's making a persistent connection through USB or Lightning between the device and the controller, and once it makes that connection, it's going to bidirectionally push data back and forth at a really high speed. It's going to have to fix its position in space using GPS satellites, using network connectivity. It's pinging the network, it's pinging the satellites to give it itself a sense of where it is in a 3D space so it knows how far the drone has flown away and how to get the drone back home if something terrible happens. In addition to that, it may have to touch a Wi-Fi network or a 3G network to download maps to the device so you can tell where you're flying. Maybe it's uploading logs so that if you lose your drone, you can find it later because those logs have been uploaded to the cloud. All this stuff is going on at the same time. So you can imagine already that if this takes over your device, it kind of should be the only application that's running at that time. And one of the suggestions I'll make at the end is if you're running other applications in the background, no matter what they are, texting, Twitter, whatever it happens to be, shut them down. Because the more horsepower you can give to this application, the more reliable and consistent the results will be for you. So I'm going to put a graphic up in a second and show you exactly what this thing's touching inside your device. So if you look closely at this chart, you're going to see pretty quickly that it's touching the network. Now, depending on which carrier you've got, that can be a GSM network or CDMA, and I could spend hours talking about the differences between those two, and there is a better one, and I'm going to give you a hint, GSM. It's got GPS connections. It's going to talk about location accuracy, and it doesn't only use GPS for that. It's going to ping your network towers and get a rough approximation of where you're standing, and then dial it in even tighter using GPS. The USB connection, I can't say enough about how hard it is to establish a consistent connection between a phone and any device. Anybody that's connected up an Android or an Apple phone to their computer to try and sync up files knows that it's a pretty kludgy interface. So to get that done right is tricky. And then to have enabling high-speed data transfers across it is another Herculean event. To do video streaming and encoding, there are applications that just do that on its own and not have to worry about all the other stuff going on at the same time. And then last, it's going to do buffering of video. It's going to store variables. It needs scratch pad space in your memory. So there's a ton of stuff that's going on simultaneously in here, which means you've got to have a device with plenty of horsepower, typically a 4-core, like a quad-core processor, a little bit of available RAM. You shouldn't have your storage space in there above 50% or 60%, because even though it's not going to use all of it, when you start filling up your storage space inside of a phone or a tablet, you get what's called fragmentation, where it isn't really a consistent image anymore. There are little gaps in between. And if this application has to find those gaps and put the application in those gaps, it's going to take extra time and extra work to put all those things back together again. So there are a lot of considerations out there. Now, in addition to that, you've got a multitude of versions of operating systems that have been out. So if I'm a coder and I have to build an application, I would love if there was one device that I could code towards, because I could put a team together in a couple of days that could code an application for that device. If I multiply that device times 10 Apple devices and 100 Android devices, how do I possibly code against all those SDKs or software development kits? It just becomes a gigantic effort. And the more operating systems and more versions of the OS that come out, that universe expands. So it makes it a lot more difficult. So let's take a look at some of the operating systems that have changed over the years. So if you look at the way DJI has coded this, they recommend some of the latest versions of the Apple operating system and the Android operating system, but both of those operating systems since the early 2000s have gone through major changes. I think there's maybe 12 versions of Android that are out, and there's another 10 or 12 versions of iOS that are out. Now again, I know that they're forward compatible, but there are sweet spots in those versions that would be something you'd want to lean towards if you were going to actually pick one to stick with. Now, I'll talk a little bit at the end of which of the operating systems are most flattering to the application, because another one of the suggestions I'm going to make at the end is that if you're having a lot of trouble trying to use your phone or your tablet that you use every day with this device, you might want to spend a couple extra bucks and dedicate a device just to this particular application. And I know that sounds like a lot, but I like the fact that I've got an older device that I can downgrade to a particular version of the operating system that works with this application well, and know that every time I fire it up, it's going to work, and not have to worry about it running a bunch of other applications on there. So that may be one of the suggestions you'll take to heart. But the background on this, I'm just trying to give you some idea of the dimensionality of this as a coder to build an application that has all those very aggressive demands of a particular electronic device like this, and then allow you as a consumer to pick from hundreds of devices on the market. Really makes it a tough effort, makes it a tough thing to accomplish. So I'm going to talk now about the Apple versions of things and how Apple may work with it, and I'll talk about Android and some of the challenges around Android, and then at the end I'll give you some suggestions on maybe what you can try to tweak whatever device you're working with. But please understand that this application, and I've worked with people that have developed applications over the years, this is a monster application because it's got so much responsibility to keep that quad in the air, flying safely, return to home safely, stream the video, keep track of what's going on, be able to control it and send telemetry information, register the telemetry took, and it's actually in a position that you expect it to be in. So there's a ton of subsystems that are working feverishly to keep that quad in the air, keep it stable, and get it home safely. And again, picking the right device can have a big impact on how reliable that system works. In this section, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about Apple's approach to technology. Now, before I get too deep into it, I promise you I'm not here to pick a fight. I know a lot of you watching this clip are fans of Android or fans of Apple. You own devices and you're flying with them today, and if they're working for you, that's great. I own a lot of Apple devices, I own a lot of Android devices, I fly with both of them on a regular basis, and for me what it comes down to is whatever device I'm using, I just want it to work and I want it to be reliable. So both Apple and Android make devices that work really well with the Go4 application, and I don't really care what operating system is running on that device. This is a widget. It's a means to an end that allows me to get a quadcopter up in the air and fly it on a beautiful afternoon and enjoy that experience. So I'm not going to have a fight about what I'm running on the tablet or the phone. I just want it to work, and I want it to work reliably. But these are two of the most popular operating systems on the planet today, and really the only two that are supported with the app. So I want to spend some time talking about Apple's approach to technology, and then I'll talk about Androids and some of the challenges with that. All right. So with the Apple side of the house, Apple's a unique company in a couple of different ways. The biggest thing I like about them, and there's things I hate about them too, but the thing I like about them is the fact that they're in complete control of the finished product. So this product here has a ton of hardware inside of it. It's got a ton of software inside of it. Every bit of that's been designed by Apple. So the board itself is designed, the chips are designed, the graphics displays are designed, the processors, the battery, everything in here is controlled by some division of Apple. Some of it's built by other companies, but it's all put together by Apple. Once they build that hardware, they then sit back and write software that can push that hardware to its absolute limits to squeeze every bit of processing power out of it and every bit of use out of the technology that's in there. They control the software and the hardware, so they've built this sort of walled garden system that ensures a consistent consumer experience every time they fire up the tablet. What it also provides for them is less variables. They've built a system where they know exactly what the thing's going to do. There are no rogue applications running. There's no tweaks I can get in there and mess with stuff. So I really like it because you pretty much fire it up, download an application, and it runs. And again, the Go4 application runs really well on the latest generations of the Apple products. So I've got an iPad mini 4 here. I've got an iPhone over here. Both of these run the Go4 application consistently, reliably, without issue. So I've been very, very lucky that these two devices work well. The parts I don't like about Apple are the fact that it is a closed system. So as a nerd, I like tinkering with stuff. So when I connect up an Android device to my computer at home, I can fire files at it. I can fire movies and music at it. I can watch those on a bunch of different applications. I can also get into the settings and tweak things, and I can sideload applications in there if I want to. If it's an application that maybe hasn't been blessed yet, it's in beta form, I can sideload it. So those are the advantages of an open system. But I understand completely by having a closed system like this, Apple's able to control the entire experience that ends up in the consumer's hands, and it really does deliver a pretty satisfying experience, especially with the Go4 application. So that's the major difference between the two. The other thing that's interesting about Apple is that, unlike Android, Apple, when it releases a new version of the operating system, kind of pushes it pretty quickly to end users, and most of the end user community grabs that new version of the operating system pretty quickly once it's released. Matter of fact, they're clamoring to get it because there are features built into the new versions of the operating system that people want. Maybe it's improvements to the camera, it's improvements to the way the mail works or whatever. The tweaks in there are things that people want to get right away. So you'll find that as that maturity of operating systems happens, and I've got a graphic up now showing you the different versions of the operating system, you'll find that people will pretty quickly gravitate to the latest version or the one just behind it. They don't lag and stay with 3 and 4 generations older of operating systems. So that's different than Android. Android tends to be a wider scattering of what operating system version they're using. People hang on to older versions of the operating system longer. So from a development perspective, knowing that your consumers are on 1 or 2 versions of the operating system you've got out allows you to fine-tune the application to work with those and certify it against those versions. Whereas with Android, in a lot of cases, you've got 4 or 5 different versions of the SDK out there that you've got to support. That's a big difference in support and sort of making the application work well together. So my recommendations, if you're going to go with Apple, is to find something like the iPad mini 4, which is a great solution, or an iPhone that's not running a ton of extra apps on top of it, and both of those will work really well for you. One other thing I want to point out, I probably shouldn't even say this, I found it incredibly curious that when the Mavic came out, you folded open those 2 arms on the bottom, that iPad mini 4 slid perfectly up into those arms. It was almost like that controller for the Mavic and the Spark was designed to accommodate this exact tablet. Now there are Android tablets that'll fit in there as well, but none of them fit as cleanly as this one does. So I don't know if that was just by chance, or maybe the guys designing the controller had a bunch of iPad mini 4s laying around the development lab and they decided to build it for that form factor, but I did find that interesting. So, read into that what you will. Anyway, that's it for the Apple side of the house. The pros on this is that it's a closed system. It's a consistent experience. It'll give you a very reliable application that'll run and give you all the telemetry information and control information you need for the quad. The downside is, same thing, it's a closed system, so you can't really do a lot to it like you can with the Android side of the house. But for my money, these 2 devices work great. Plug them in, you're off and running. In the Android camp, things are a little bit more complicated for a whole lot of different reasons. So in this market, Android products on any given day are 6 to 7 times more popular than Apple products, which means 7 of these are going out the door for every Apple product sold. Now, the reason they enjoy that big a chunk of the market is because unlike Apple, which is a single company that designs, builds, distributes, and sells their products, in the Android space, there are tons of companies that build products that run a stock Android version. So you've got a lot of routes to market over here against a single route to market over there. So it's almost like Apple against everybody else. And you would think that's a good thing, but therein lies the problem. Because if all these companies used a stock version of Android, all their products at the end of the day would look very similar. And consumers would look at that and it would be a race to the bottom on pricing. So it would turn out to be who's got the cheapest tablet or phone that runs that version of Android. So companies have gotten smart about that. Now I'll pick on Samsung a little bit because they own the bigger chunk of that market. I think they're 50 or 55% of the market. Samsung said, we've got to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace because if I don't have competitive differentiation, I can't sell my product against a less expensive phone that essentially does the same thing. So the way this works with Samsung is 2 years ahead or 3 years ahead of a phone being released, a brilliant team of engineers will sit down at a blank board and start designing that phone. And they'll decide what display they're going to use, what chipset they're going to use, how big it is, how big the battery is. All the intrinsics that build a hardware platform is being designed by this team. They eventually produce that product, and what they end up with is just a genius hardware platform that's sitting there doing nothing. Meanwhile, Google's in their labs feverishly working on the latest version of Android that they're shipping to Samsung. When that arrives, they load the software on top of the hardware, which is compliant against that software. They breathe life into the device, and voila, they have a phone, right? And they've got the latest phone out in the street. And it'd be great if they stopped there, but they don't. So what Samsung does is say, look, we need to enhance that user experience because maybe we've got features in the phone nobody else has, or we just need to jazz it up a little bit to look different or behave differently than the other guys. So they have a team of software engineers that design user interfaces and applications and setting changes on top of that Android operating system. So you've got Android here and the Samsung stuff sitting on top of it. They've fundamentally changed that end user experience and they've changed the software. So when I take the Go4 application, I'm sure it's going to run on a stock version of Android, but it may not run on this version of Android because of all the changes they've made in the phone. Now think about that. They've made changes. These guys have made changes. If you go to something like an Amazon Fire product, they've changed that operating system tremendously. So you can't possibly load a lot of applications on top of that because they've kind of pared back the functionality of that device for their needs. So it's not, even though it's running Android, it's not, a lot of the things in Android aren't available to you on a device like that. So if you're Google and you're sitting back going, okay, we built this version of Android to run on your device and we've tested the Go4 application against it and it runs fluidly on there, it may not run on the end device because you've changed stuff on that device which make it less of a pure Android version. So that's a challenge for most of the companies. And I know there's been a lot of Skyping back and forth between, hey, the Samsung products won't run the Go4 app, it's a problem with the app, and the app saying, no, it's a problem with the phone. That's fundamentally where that comes from, is that if this were a stock version of Android that didn't have all the tweaks built into it, it would run pretty well. But the fact that they've made changes to it, in a lot of cases, will cause problems. So there are versions of the Samsung phones that run great and their tablets run great, but some of them won't. It's because of that change. Now, if you think about it, that's also a problem for updates, because if I'm a software developer for Apple, Apple controls when those software updates come out. So when Apple decides I'm putting out a new version of the operating system, you immediately start to get annoying messages on your phone that, hey, there's a new version of iOS. I'm going to download it tonight at midnight. Is that okay? So they're kind of forcing that upgrade on you, maybe in advance of you being ready for it. With Android, because Samsung tweaks a lot of the stuff on top of Android, a new version of Android will come out. It's sent to Samsung. They won't immediately push it out to their end users because they've got to make changes to it to modify their user interface. So you get this a bit of a delay or this bit of lag between the new version of Android coming out and users adopting that, either because they've chosen not to or because the manufacturer had to do some background work to get their interface working with it and it's been delayed being released. But as an app developer, if I'm in the labs at Go4, I'm thinking, I'm building this for the latest version of Android. Why are you not running that? Why are most of your users running 3 versions back of Android? So they've got this wider stretch, I guess, of different versions of Android that have to be supported on an application. Whereas with the iPhone, you're going to find in Apple products in general, you're going to find that the operating systems are updated much more quickly across all their devices. So when I release a new application, most people have the latest version of the OS and they can just take advantage of it. I don't have to sort of regression test against older versions of the application. So it does make things a little bit more complicated in this camp. And if you think further that they've designed their own product to run against that compliant version of Android, well, NVIDIA's built it to the same standard, but maybe it doesn't run quite as well. Or maybe the next tablet or phone doesn't run quite as well on top of Android. So even with a stock version of Android, sometimes you have issues with it running based on the hardware that manufacturer's put together. So there's a lot of moving pieces inside here. Now my recommendation would be, in the Android side of the house, if you're going to pick a device, try to find a device with as little change as possible from the standard Android version. So if you can find a product that runs either a pure version of Android or close to pure version of Android, that's the one you want to go with, because all that extra headroom that's being taken up by that specialized user interface is just complicating things as far as the application being able to run on that device. Now, these are pretty heavily modified. This one isn't so much. This one's pretty heavily modified, but even still, because of their prowess in the market space and how large they are, Android's made some accommodations for them, and DJI has made some accommodations to fix it to work on that phone. But honestly, and I'm not defending DJI here, even though it sounds like I am, it's not their responsibility to tweak the app to work on a specific phone. They should just code it against the basic version of whatever Android version is being released. If it runs on that, it should just be a matter of shut up, go fix it. But people want to blame everybody for those kind of things. All right, so that's my suggestion in the Android space, is to find a device that's as close to stock as possible. And if you're really desperate and you dedicate that device to just your flying, try and stick with Lollipop, which is one of the versions of Android. I think 5.1.1 is the one that everybody recommends as being an incredibly stable version of Android. And if you're only using the tablet or phone to fly with, there's no need to do all those updates. There's no need to rush to the latest version of Android because it's got some kind of wacky new texting thing you think is cool. Just stay on that 5.1.1 and you've got basically a slave device that'll work with your controller for a long period of time. The other thing I wanted to talk about is with the development internally at DJI, they like Android. So a lot of their products are based on Android. So I've got a Crystal Sky monitor here. I've got a Phantom 4 Pro Plus controller here. The headset, the Google goggles here. Not the Google goggles, the DJI goggles here run on Android, but they're closed systems. So a lot of people are complaining about it. They're saying, look, I'm not going to buy that Phantom 4 Pro controller because I want to sideload applications and I want to put Litchi on there and all kinds of screen capture programs. Well, DJI has realized the more they control that entire system and minimize that nonsense, the other applications that are running on there, the better the user experience is going to be, and the cleaner it's going to run, the faster it's going to run, and be more reliable. So you're seeing a trend to move this direction, which is exactly what Apple's doing with their products. They're kind of controlling the hardware, the software build, and what applications run inside that environment, and these are rock solid. So when I fire up this Crystal Sky monitor, this thing just runs, and it runs fast, and it runs clean. There's no lags in boot up time. The video is rock solid. Same thing on the controller and same thing on the headset. The minute I move to more of a multi-purpose device, no matter what it is, the more complicated it gets and the more problems start to crop up. So in this world, if you can go with a dedicated device, home run, you are giving up the opportunity to add other applications to it, but so what? I'll figure that out. So I love going this direction. If I'm going with a multi-purpose device, try and find one that runs as close to stock as possible. If you can get it to run 5.1.1, the Lollipop version, that would be good. And then lastly, you might want to consider dedicating a device, like I said earlier, just to flying. So if you're gonna pick a tablet up and it's an Android tablet, try and get one that's a stock version. Don't load a lot of other unnecessary applications on there. If you can do it, don't load anything on there but the Go4 application, and just consider that your screen for flying. That's going to fix a lot of your problems right out of the gate. So I hope this part made sense. I didn't over-explain anything, but that's really it in a nutshell for Android products. Now, the last thing I'll mention, I should have stopped there, but I'll mention this. Even in the Samsung universe, they make a bunch of different phones at the same time. So this is one of like 6 phones that came out at the same time. Each of those phones are different as far as the user interface and the tweaks they make to the software. So it isn't even like if you get the Go4 application running on a Samsung phone, it'll run on all of them. It won't, because they're all different. They're all like different children. They all have different personalities and they have different approaches to things from a software perspective. So it is a complicated environment, and when you go to the forums, they'll talk about ones that work and ones that don't work. Follow those suggestions, but in general, what I said about keeping it skinny, keeping it close to stock is really your best bet. In this last section, I wanted to offer a few suggestions you can try if you happen to be struggling with a particular device. Now, honestly, there is no silver bullet, and each of these suggestions are things that I've worked with other people on to improve the reliability of the Go4 application on their particular device, so maybe some of them will help your situation. Now, as I go through these, I want you to think about what device you're using, how you're connecting up to the controller, and maybe even what quad you're flying, because not all of them are going to work for everybody, but some of these might actually help you make that application more reliable on the device you have in front of you. The first thing I'd suggest, and people trip over this a lot, and it almost seems like a no-brainer, is to make sure whatever device you're using at least meets the minimum requirements for the Go4 application to run. So many times people will use an older device and figure, the application will run, it's no big deal. Those application requirements are pretty hardcore. You've got to have typically a core quad processor, a pretty hefty processor, plenty of RAM available, a certain resolution on the display. You've got to have available storage space on the device. So before you start, driving yourself crazy trying to figure out what's going on, just check the minimum specs of whatever tablet or phone you're using against what DJI recommends, and at least that's a good place to start. The next thing I would check is the application you're running, the Go4 application. That runs really well against certain versions of the firmware, but a lot of times people get out of step between the two. So they may do a firmware update on the quad or the controller or the batteries and not update the application, or vice versa. They'll go to the newest version of the application and they'll ignore that update the firmware thing. And if you get out of step on a lot of cases where the application is different than the firmware, you're going to get kind of wonky results. So what I recommend always is, if you decide you're going to upgrade the application, make sure that there's new firmware for the quad or the controller or the batteries. You do it all in one fell swoop. It's the same thing if you do the quad, make sure it doesn't need a new version of the application to run on your device. I know a lot of people don't like to jump to the latest versions of that firmware. I'm one of them. So I usually wait a couple of weeks and I check the forums to see if people are belly aching about a new version of firmware or a new version of the application on the quad I'm flying before I do the update. But if it's all quiet on the Russian front, I'll do that update and I'll do it all in one fell swoop. And that'll eliminate a lot of the inconsistencies that tend to come up there. The next thing I'll say is, and I call this, make sure you have enough elbow room. And what I mean by that is, you can't use a device that's almost full from a memory perspective. So if you've got a lot of extra applications running on there that's eating up your RAM, or if you've loaded a lot of movies and songs and other things on there, so you see your usable space is down to 20-25%, that's not a healthy place to be loading an application that's this big. You want to clear out as much of that as you can. And I know it can be painful because you're pulling your songs and movies off there, but you really can't load it onto a device that's got a very little amount of memory left, because as I mentioned before, there's this term fragmentation, that as you add and delete applications, that memory space is no longer contiguous. What happens is, as you load an application, it typically loads it in order, but when you delete one, it'll pull pieces out of that memory in the stack of memory, so it'll be like a piece of Swiss cheese. You've got gaps there. When you load the new application on top, it'll load it into those gaps, and if it's something like Go4, it's going to have a hard time reconstructing that application from all those little pieces across the span of memory. So you want to make sure that before you load the application and start running it, that you've got plenty of elbow room, you've got a lot of extra space. If you can free up 50% of the space, that's wonderful. And make sure you've got enough RAM space in there too to run the application. Those are just basic blocking and tackling things you want to check. The next thing I'll suggest is, because the application has such a hungry appetite for processor power and for RAM, try and shut down every application you can that isn't Go4 related. So if you're running Twitter in the background, if you've got news feeds coming, if you've got a texting imaging thing going on, if you've got, a lot of people forget this, but you've got background applications running that are updating the cloud. If you're on an iPhone product, maybe it's throwing photos at the cloud in the background. All those background processes that are running are taking up or taking attention away from the processor, and they're eating up resources that the 4 application is going to need to run. So you don't want to have contention in there for the attention of that processor. You want the Go4 application to sort of have access to everything, and everything else be quiet at that point. And that's why a lot of times I worry about loading up a lot of the applications that'll show you it's safe to fly. Once you know it's safe to fly, shut that application down. You don't need to have that thing running in the background. If you start that up and you clear your path and you know you're nowhere near an airport and you're nowhere near a no-fly zone, shut that application down and save that space. The next thing I'll talk about is the cabling. So a lot of the quads use a cable from the controller, obviously, to the device you're using, whether it be an Apple product or an Android product. Not all those cables are created equally, and a lot of people tend to go to eBay or Amazon and try to find a $4 cable, and they're like, it's an Apple cable, it'll work fine. The cable can work for certain functions, but not others. So that cable might work really well for charging your phone, but when you try to transfer big bursts of data through that cable, and maybe it's not the best cable quality-wise, you can get noise inside the cable that'll cause crosstalk between the wires. So if you're having trouble, the easiest thing to do is to change the cable. Try that first. That's something you can find a friend that's got a cable that matches it, change out the cable, and if that solves your problem, you're good to go. I've also found that, and I'm not trying to sell you anything here, but I've found that shorter cables are better. The longer cable you have, not that it takes longer to go through there, it's just the longer cable you have, it acts like an antenna. So if you're in an area where there's electrostatic noise or any kind of magnetic noise, that thing acts as an antenna. Now you've got crosstalk from an external source getting into the cable and causing you problems. So the shorter you can make the cable between the device and the controller, the better you're going to be overall. So make sure you check that. The last thing I'll talk about, and I'm reading these off a list here, is I've seen cases, and this is weird, I've seen cases where when you put this device inside a case and it's either really thick or worse, if it's got a metallic back on it, I've seen interference happen with GPS coordination, with compass orientation. So sometimes the case you put on your phone or your tablet can impact the performance, especially on something like the Mavic, because the Mavic uses, unlike these guys which use potentiometers inside there for the joysticks, the Mavic uses magnetic. So it's got a magnet on there and it's got read sensors underneath there that are reading the magnets. If you've got something that's got a metallic case and you get it near that magnet, that's going to screw everything up inside there. So what I would suggest is try a new cable, take the case off whatever device you're using and try it without the case. See if either of those improve the situation. These last two are going to be a little bit awkward to talk about, but I've convinced myself that when I use a device with my quads, I've dedicated that device to the quad. So I no longer fly with a phone that I use on a regular basis. If I'm using my phone, it's my phone. Maybe I'll tether to it, but I'm not going to use that phone on the device. I'll take an iPad mini 4 like this one, and I'll use it for nothing but flying. So I bought a dedicated device. I would recommend the same with Android. So find a device that's within your budget, within your price range, dedicated to flying. Don't start loading a bunch of other apps on it. Don't watch movies on it. Don't load up a real bunch of heavy apps on there. Just keep it clean, keep it pure, and use it specifically for flying. That's going to solve a lot of your problems right there. And I know it sounds crazy to spend money on a dedicated device to fly, but that device is such a critical component in keeping that wonderful craft in the air and keeping it safe that $1,000 investment in the air certainly warrants a couple $100 investment in a tablet. And again, as I said at the top of this, I view these as widgets that help me fly. So I'm going to dedicate a tablet to that flying experience and guarantee that I'm not going to have issues. The last thing I'll say, and this is where the flamethrowers come out, on experience of all the things that I've flown, I've really found the Apple products to be much more reliable than the Android products, bar none. And I can say that across the board. The NVIDIA Shield's the one that I use on a regular basis, and that's rock solid. But I've gone through 18 or 20, maybe even 25 Android devices that have been kind of wonky. And some of them have been certified devices that easily met the standards, weren't running extra applications. There's just something different about the Android environment and the way that the DJI Go4 application is written to run on the Android. I don't know whether it's an interface problem with USB. I don't know what the differences are, but my experience, and I'm not again trying to sell products, but I found the Apple products to be rock solid. The Android products, when you get one that works and you keep it clean, it's going to run for you. But in large part, when I check all the Android products against all the Apple products, they're not as reliable. I just had some issues with the Android side of the house, and I know that's out there in the forums as well. A lot of people are struggling to get the Android products running. So that's my last thought: is maybe use a dedicated device and keep it just for flying. And then if you're going to pick a device, you've got to go out and buy a brand new device. You really can't go wrong with the iPad mini 4 because not only does it work reliably, but it fits in the handle of the Mavic or the Spark. So if you've got either of those quads, you don't have to use an external tablet holder to use that particular device. So anyway, that's all I had as sort of a closing statement. I'm sure there'll be other suggestions and I'll add them to the comments below. If I've missed anything, I'll try to get back to you. Please leave it in the comments below. I honestly do my best to answer those comments as quickly as I can, but sometimes we get hundreds of comments and I have to slice through them, but I got to spend time also doing clips, and I like to get out and fly a little bit too. So I've got to kind of, portion my time out. Anyway, that's it for today. As I always say, I love making these clips, so I hope you guys are finding value in it. This is one that I've been wanting to do for a long time, put a lot of work into it, had a lot of people asking questions, so hopefully you find value in this. If you, again, have any questions, drop them below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button down there. We like the subscriber count growing the way it's going. It really encourages me to do more clips like this and really spend more time putting these things together for you guys, so do that. And that's pretty much it. So thanks again for watching. And as I say every time, until next time, happy flying.